Hey there, I'm Kyle Hamrick, Senior Motion Designer for School of Motion. This session is Beyond the Basics of Adobe After Effects, Intermediate Skills. I'll be using a piece I created for Adobe last year as a way to showcase various parts of the motion design workflow and hopefully show you a lot of cool and helpful tips along the way. We'll be talking about several different stages of a good motion design workflow, starting with concepting and pre-production. I'll be showing you the ways that I use other Adobe apps when I'm creating a piece and how a cross-app workflow can be helpful and efficient. Then we'll dive into After Effects itself and we'll look at some ways to step your work up to the next level, including tips for finessing your keyframes in the graph editor, navigating complex projects, using advanced features like master properties, ways to artfully transform footage, and then I'll have a few cool After Effects tips for you as well. So when Adobe first reached out regarding this project, I was obviously excited for the opportunity. It sounded like it would be a fun technical challenge as well as a creative one. As the project developed in my brain, it became clear I was essentially getting to create a love letter to After Effects, and I have to say it's one of the cooler opportunities I've ever been given. So Adobe's specific request was for a project that could serve as a benchmark in a variety of ways and would also be aesthetically pleasing, quote, not just a science project, and help showcase some of the ways that you can use After Effects. As part of the benchmarking process, it needed to include a piece of footage, which meant an end user could also potentially try out different sizes and formats. There was a desire to focus on GPU accelerated effects, as that creates a pretty easy A/B for users to see the speed gains that those can bring. And lastly, it was likely this project would be publicly shared, so users who wanted to explore the workflow and structure of such a project could download it and explore it. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about, and then we can dive into some of the process of how this was made. And I'll try to give you, as I said, as many useful tips along the way as I can. I know you're excited for me to dive straight into After Effects, and I am too, but let's take a minute and talk about some of the earlier steps in the process. It can be really tempting to just hop into After Effects and start doing stuff, and I definitely do that, but there's a time and a place for that. Animation is a very labor-intensive process, so for an actual project, you want to make sure you actually know what you're trying to achieve before you think about animating anything. So let's take a look at my storyboard sketches here. As you can see, I just drew these on paper, which can be a good way to get the ideas down without being too fussy about it. I decided to make this whole thing a little meta. We'll start with a keyframe rolling in, a cursor clicks it, revealing some other kinds of keyframes, which I'll split apart to expose a bunch of this cool internal After Effects craziness. And then a pen tool pulls a Bezier path across, and that pulls everything back together for the logo reveal. This idea allowed that middle section to be really flexible, which is good since some of those technical specifics were still a little bit of a moving target at this early stage of the project. Going abstract allowed for the wiggle room to pack in footage and effects and variant versions and whatever, and still have it all make some kind of sense. It also made sense to go ahead and just lay out my storyboard right here in Photoshop, thanks to the Artboards feature. It's really nice to just lay everything out in one place, but still have it all be editable. And you can make little tweaks, duplicate elements between frames, and so on. I don't usually consider myself as much a designer as an animator, but I'll definitely come in here to create more refined frames for a lot of projects, which you can then send over to After Effects as individual layers. It just wasn't the case here. From there, I dove into Illustrator and dropped in a couple of screen grabs of the After Effects UI stuff I liked, and started creating some of the hero elements I knew I was going to need. My intent was to be converting all of these to shape layers once they're in After Effects, so that the final project wouldn't be referencing any external files except for the footage and the audio. It's definitely way easier to create this kind of stuff here in Illustrator, especially some of the teeny little cursors and stuff. A few of these, like the Bezier handles and other stuff where I realized I'd really just probably be creating them out of parametric shapes anyway, I just decided it would be easy enough to build those directly in After Effects, so I didn't bother with those here. So it does require a little bit of file prep, and there are a few limitations, but you can absolutely send your Illustrator files over to After Effects and either work with the discrete layers you've created in Illustrator, or you can convert some of those elements directly into shape layers in After Effects. That gives you full control over just about everything, but it also means you're going to be dealing with a lot more complexity in your After Effects project. So you do want to be mindful about whether that conversion is actually necessary or not, because it often isn't. Even on the best planned projects, you're probably going to have a few elements that you don't realize you need until you're partway through. Or maybe you realize that the thing you have isn't quite built in the right way for how it ends up needing to be animated. So it's really good to be comfortable hopping around between these different apps and be comfortable with the workflow of sending things over to After Effects in a clean and efficient way. To that point, I'll also actually start most of my motion design projects in Premiere. Especially for projects that are driven by voiceover or music, spending a little effort to get the timing ironed out here, where it's really easy and fast to make those edits, and the audio tools are much more robust, it's so much nicer than trying to handle all of that directly in After Effects. You can import nice looking storyboards or even just the super rough sketches and work through the timing here to figure out if you have any gaps or maybe even places where you need to cut something. You can even keyframe stuff right here in Premiere, even if it's just in a basic way, to roughly do a couple of the big moves and see how everything flows. The keyframes are the same anyway, and so then if you push this timeline into After Effects, which you can do in a couple different ways, you can even just use those, or copy paste them to another layer or whatever, if you like something that you built in here. Motion design is very much about the process of iterating and refining, and anytime you have an opportunity to catch problems earlier in the process when they're still relatively easy to fix, that's definitely a win in my book. Premiere is also my app of choice for finishing most of my projects. While this benchmarking project is pretty short, for anything much longer, it quickly becomes a lot more efficient to be exporting an image sequence or a ProRes file or something like that out of After Effects, and then marrying that to the final audio here in Premiere. For longer or bigger projects where you might have multiple sections or even multiple artists working on the project, trying to assemble all of that directly in After Effects can really be a lot more trouble than it's worth. So again, you want to think about using the right tool for the job, you know? Speaking of audio, I did want to take a minute and give a big shout out to Wes Slover at Sono Sanctus and Joe Basile, who worked together to create the awesome audio track for this piece. After Effects has two really noteworthy sounds that every user knows. That chime that tells you your render's done, and that dreaded sheep noise telling you that your render has failed. I handed these two audio files along with a super rough draft of my animation and a few loose ideas and let Wes and Joe just work their magic. If you listen closely, you'll actually hear each of these sounds used in several different ways in here. I'll play it again here so that you can listen for those. One last thing before I dive into After Effects, I also wanted to take a second and talk about the color palette, which is another of those things that you really want to try to nail down at the beginning, so you aren't later going back and having to change 100 little individual elements that you've already animated, right? I went through and pulled colors from the After Effects interface and branding, but of course those UI colors were chosen either to be unobtrusive or specifically to highlight things, and they weren't really designed with a project like this in mind. So I reached out to my friend Dorka Museb, who has a much better grasp of color than I do, and she helped me dial in a color palette that really made sense here. I did want to point out that I created this project in 2019, so you may notice the older icon colors being more prominent here. I did update the logo at the end to the new color scheme, but since AE had that pink and purple for like the last 8 years, I felt it was appropriate to keep those in here and let the new logo kind of emerge from those at the end. Okay, so I'm finally over here in After Effects now, and the first thing I want to talk about in terms of really upping your game here is keyframe easing. So here's just one element from my project here. I've got that first keyframe object that kind of rotates in and then splits here. Every one of these actual keyframes has been touched to some degree to customize it. And if I start showing you some comparisons to ones that haven't been, hopefully you're going to start seeing that difference really quick. So here's one where I just set everything back to totally linear. So all these keyframes are just totally default at this point, okay? And you see how it just feels stiff and mechanical and pretty clunky, especially this kind of split and push in here. So let's take a look at this easy eased version. To do that, you just highlight your keys and then you can right click on Keyframe Assistant, Easy Ease, or you can press F9, which is what I usually do because I like hotkeys. So all these keyframes now have been easy eased. So it definitely feels smoother than that linear one. And I'll show you a side-by-side comparison in a minute here. But this last bit especially, it's still slow and kind of meh, right? now that you've had your eyes on those, here is that original again with lots of customized easing. Now watch, in particular, the rotation here really has like a lot of snap to it at the end, and these little accent lines have a really nice swish as they go around, and the split and push just really kind of whooshes into it here, really nice and snappy. So if you look at them all side by side here, you'll hopefully really be able to see those differences. Really just having the eye, developing the eye to be able to see these differences and kind of see where something needs to go. This is really the key here, because you can tweak on it all day long, but if you don't know where you're going, then you're not going to get real far, right? There are obviously a lot of animation principles and stuff like that that you ideally need to learn to really be able to hone this ability properly. But a lot of times too, you're kind of just feeling it. Like, does your project call for something really crisp and snappy? There are times where these linear keyframes are totally appropriate too. I don't want to make it sound like they're not. But when you start looking at these here, even the easy eased one compared to something that's been heavily customized, you can really feel that difference, right? Feel the way it just snaps apart there and kind of pushes towards us compared to this slow and boring one here and here, right? So let's take a look at some actual keyframes that we can play with here. And I'll take a minute to explain the graph editor and how it works. So this top one up here is just linear. I've separated the dimensions, which you can do right here by right-clicking. The way the graph editor works with position is a little bit different than some of the other properties. I'll be showing you the value graph, which I think makes the most sense here. And that doesn't really work with the unified position property. But visually, I think this is the best way to demonstrate this concept, okay? So right now, this green one hasn't been touched yet, but you're going to see the difference between the linear and the easy eased here. Again, I just highlighted that, pressed F9, and they're easy eased. So watch the pink versus the blue, and you'll see the difference. Pink starts off kind of slow, and then it gets fast in the middle, and then eases back to a stop, right? Whereas the blue one just starts, and it's the same speed all the way across. And right now, the green is just linear because I haven't touched it yet. But I have clicked this little graph icon here, which is going to mean when I open the graph editor, this particular property is always going to be shown. You can also highlight individual properties, and then when you open the graph editor, they'll appear in there. So this little graph button right up here opens up the graph editor. And in this case, it's a representation of the changing value of that X position of that layer over time. I think the best way to describe a keyframe is just a value at a time, okay? So if you want to change something about that, you either change the value or the time at which it occurs, right? So After Effects and other computer animation applications, they also give you the ability to change how that change happens between those keyframes, all right? And in this case, we have this one value here. It's 202 on X, and up to this point is just a static value. And then when it hits this point, this keyframe here, it starts changing at a constant speed until it gets to its second keyframe, and then it just stops. And now it's that second static value, right? Just for comparison here, if we also look at the eased one, see this nice little S curve that it has? Okay, I'm going to click back off that, and we'll start changing this one. Now you can actually select these keyframes right here, and I can even press F9 in here to go ahead and just easy ease them. And then what you can also do is start pulling these handles around. These are just Bezier handles, like they're a path or an Illustrator object or anything like that. You can pull these around, and if we did this here, so we're going to be easing out of this value slowly, and then we start to speed up because it still has to span the same amount of change during this time, right? And then as we come into this other one, we're going to be slowly easing back to a stop. So right here, we're going to have this really nice snap right around kind of this first third of the time span here. And then there, you can see it just really eases into that stop. If instead we wanted this to kind of start very suddenly and then have sort of this really slow swoop in the middle, you could kind of reverse this way. So if you pull this handle up, and then you'll kind of have this static value, and then boom, it's just going to launch into this movement, okay? and then I could pull this one down. You can see here in the middle, it's going to be almost flat, which means it's going to be just kind of creeping here in the middle. But it's also going to kind of slam to an abrupt stop again here at the end. So you'll notice in all these cases, it's still just those same two keyframes, but you can make such a world of difference here by the way that they move. So tweaking these, manipulating these, you can make it snappy or smooth or whatever is appropriate for your project. Just make it move exactly the way that it needs to for that context, right? I know this topic isn't quite as exciting, and hopefully a lot of you are already doing these, but honestly, simple project organization is really one of the biggest things that you can do to up your game here in After Effects. So let's check out this project panel here on the left versus the one on the right, or these two examples of timelines. So imagine someone was handing off a project to you. Which one would you want? Yeah. Here in your After Effects project panel, you can create folders by just clicking this little icon here. If you already have a folder selected, it'll put the new one inside it like this. So let's give this thing a name, and I'll drop my video files into it. You can also grab something or multiple somethings and just drag them down to the folder icon, and poof, we have a folder. Put this in here. There, isn't that nicer? In your timeline, taking the time to properly label, trim, and color code your layers makes a huge difference. You can rename any layer by selecting it and hitting enter. We'll just give this a new name here. Much better. Since it exits the screen, there's really no need for the layer to keep existing over here, so we can trim it by dragging the end like this, or you can also set your ins and outs with hotkeys by pressing Alt or Option along with the bracket keys. Now we'll come over here and click on this little color chip. I'll choose yellow just to help it really stand out. Yeah, there we go. So let's take a quick look at the before and after here. Now you're spending your time being creative instead of hunting through your own project. Yes. Since this is an intermediate session, I'm going to assume that most of you know what a pre-composition or pre-comp is. But just in case, it's any composition that's nested within another composition. Basically the same thing as using a smart object in Photoshop or nesting sequences when you're in Premiere. You can take a bunch of complicated stuff in your project and make it function like it's essentially just one object. If you want to do it with some existing elements, you can just select them like this, right-click one of them, and choose Pre-compose. And then you're going to give this a meaningful name, right? The only downside is that if you want to make changes inside here, it can mean a lot of back and forth. But After Effects has a solution for you. That solution is Master Properties, which are one of my favorite features and really helps with project organization. They're maybe a little hard to wrap your head around at first, but once you do, they are so super powerful. So I'm just going to start with a simple example here, and the way that these work leverages the Essential Graphics panel, which you can get by clicking Window, Essential Graphics. So I'm going to reveal a property here. I'll just search for color. Yes, you have a search bar right here that reveals stuff, another pro tip. And let's say that I want this base color of the keyframe to be something that I might be able to edit somewhere else. So I'll just drag this up here, and I might go ahead and rename that base color, just so that I remember exactly what I'm working with. So I'm going to go ahead into this other comp and bring in my build comp that I just created. We'll drop that right in here. Again, this is a pre-comp, just like we were using before, we just talked about. And you can see that I already have some animation built in here as well. So it brought all that animation in, just like you'd expect a pre-comp to. But if I open this up, now I have not just my normal transforms, like on any layer, but I also have this thing called Master Properties. And anything that you've dropped into that Essential Graphics panel within that pre-comp is now going to show up here. And what that enables is changing this thing without having to go back into the pre-comp, which if you've worked in After Effects much at all, you're going to start seeing how huge this is right away. So I'm just going to change this to a deeper blue, and you'll notice that I didn't need to go back into the pre-comp to change that. The other big thing is that the original composition stays how it was. Interesting. I'll talk more about that in a minute. So you also have these little push-pull buttons right here. If I want, I could pull from the original and reset it to the original color. You'll notice now this goes away because it's back to that default value, okay? I'll just undo that. I could, if I decided this is what I want to be the new default, push that value in there. And now within that pre-comp, that's the new default value, okay? So let's change that again to something else here. And you can see in here, I also have these position keyframes. Maybe I want to add that property up here as well. I'll get this little warning in this case, just hit OK and ignore that right now, it's not relevant. And looky there, it just automatically added it, and now those keyframes are also visible here in this parent composition. And the big thing here is that I can edit these. So I'm editing the animation that's inside that pre-comp without having to actually dive inside it. And yeah, this is all super cool, but let me show you something even better. I'm just going to size this down, kind of move it up here, and then create a duplicate of this by hitting Control or Command D so that I have a second one. I'll move this down here just so that you can see both copies. So you can see they're doing the same thing, same keyframes, but I can make this one be different. I'm going to change the timing on the second one here. And plus I could change the color on this one. Maybe we'll go with that. There we go. Wait a minute, so these are both referencing one pre-composition, but I've done two totally different things with them, and neither of them is messing with the original, right? Right. These are iterative. You can actually create iterations of a pre-comp using master properties. So if you can think of a use case where you're going to use the same thing but in a couple different ways, like say titles or lower thirds, or coloring things different ways, or even if you just have one copy of a thing with some internal complexity and you just want to expose a couple keyframes so that you can align that time with other elements in your project, master properties is such a huge step for your workflow. Just keeps you from having to jump back and forth a bunch of times, keeps you from having to make a bunch of useless copies of the same thing, right? It's awesome. Remember that one of the intents of this project is that a user can potentially swap out the video clip to test the performance of different footage formats. That means the included clip needs to be properly licensed, and also that the project still needs to look reasonably similar with other clips in its place. I didn't have anything too specific in mind, but it turned out the small library of footage Adobe provided me with was mostly gardening clips. Not exactly what I'd been thinking of, but this project is all about figuring out how to be creative within these boundaries. So I found this clip of a dolly shot past some arugula, which turns out to actually have a really nice motion and texture to it, and it's just the right kind of abstract. I added in a few effects to give it a more trippy, kaleidoscopic look, and ended up using several copies of the footage, but all trimmed and cropped in ways that make it very prominent, but never really the star, which means that it still works pretty well with just about anything you might drop in here. I think this is a great example of taking an asset you might never have chosen originally and finding a new way of looking at it to turn it into something new and different. One other cool feature in this benchmark project is this control layer that actually has a couple on-off switches where you can toggle different color variations or different effects on and off. Now, if you want to know how to do something like that, it's actually probably a lot easier than you think, especially if you're just working with opacity, which is the case here. So I just have one layer here and I've got my opacity revealed. I'm going to right click, choose Effects, Expression Controls, Checkbox Control. That'll add that right here, and I could work with that up here in the effect controls or open it right here in the timeline as well. So the way a checkbox control works is just an on-off switch, which means it's actually a binary switch, 0 or a 1 in computer speak, right? And if you remember back to like 3rd grade math, anything times 0 is 0, and anything times 1 is itself, okay? So if you want to make a nice flexible on-off switch that actually still lets you adjust the property, all you have to do is create a quick expression here. I'm going to Alt or Option click this stopwatch to create an expression, and I'll type value, which references the original value of the property without the expression. And then I'll say times, this little asterisk key here. And then I'm just going to use this little expression pick whip here, push that right up to the checkbox control. So now it's taking this value, whatever it is, times either 0 or 1, okay? So if this is off, it's going to always be 0. If this is on, it's going to always be whatever the value is. So I can actually adjust this to, 50 something here, and it still works as an on-off switch, which gives me a lot of flexibility and means I can still easily turn this on and off. If you copy paste this expression to a bunch of layers, then you could toggle whole chunks of your project from one place, which is really awesome. So wow, 25 minutes goes by really fast, doesn't it? But we got a chance to go over some important steps of the motion design creation process, talk about ways to use different Adobe apps at different stages of your projects, and hopefully learn some new stuff within After Effects itself that'll make your next project that much better. Thank you so much for watching today. Again, my name is Kyle Hamrick. You can find me on Twitter or Instagram, and I appear regularly on the School of Motion YouTube page. If something in this presentation was helpful or inspiring for something you're working on, I'd love it if you tag me in a post and let me know. So long.